Welcome back. All right, so who's the best defenseman in the National Hockey League? That's an interesting suggestion. I can't hear you. Anyways, when you ask that question and when you get into lists of who the best defensemen are in the NHL, and I mean, I did a list of who I feel are the best defensemen in the NHL over the summer, knowing full well nobody would agree with that opinion. And when I see lists on the internet, the way I look at it is I always look at it like, that's an interesting list. They've got that guy there. Cool. And I don't get upset about players being like, if somebody has McAvoy outside the top 20, I'm not going to say this list is garbage. If somebody has Quinn Hughes 50th or 60th, I mean, I'd definitely raise an eyebrow to see somebody ranked that low, who I think is pretty good. But again, when we get into talking about defensemen, it really does enter into vibes territory eventually. And it does feel like that happens. So, first off, what do we look at when we're looking for a Norris Trophy winner? Well, goals, assists, and points seem to be big. And offensive capability is huge. And then you get into the argument of, but they're a defenseman, so they should primarily be a defender. And yet, if you're putting the puck into the other net, that is to the benefit of your team. So as a defenseman, you are helping the team, not hindering them necessarily. Zone exits. So zone exits and just passing in general is a huge measure, I think, for defensemen and whether they're good. And you guys know what I'm talking about here, where a guy's coming out of the zone and he knows the right pass to make. He knows where to look on the ice. There's that whole hockey IQ. I didn't put hockey IQ up here because it's this kind of nebulous thing that you know it when you see it. And there isn't really a measure of it. All of these things can measure how good a player is. Notice PDO isn't on the board because it doesn't count. But zone exits are important if you're a defenseman. If you're likely to cough up the puck in your own zone or your passes don't work and it ends up with an icing, this is something that's noteworthy, right? Giveaways versus takeaways. I've always looked at the numbers that the National Hockey League has for tracking giveaways and takeaways, and I've always thought they're low. Like watching a game live and looking and going, well, that was giveaway, that was a takeaway. And then I look at the official stats after the game, and it really doesn't count them as much as what you see. So this is where it gets interesting too, because there may be times where you're watching a game and you're like, well, he heaved the puck away 5 times. You could be right. The NHL might only track one of them. So giveaways and takeaways can work. And as I've said, whenever we talk about stats, there's still a human being that's watching and tracking that information. So we try to take the humanity out of it. We try to make it so it's not objective. And then you look at the hit totals in, say, Minnesota or with the Islanders, and you go, what's going on there? So what qualifies as a hit can change from one game to another as well. And that's on the board here too. So we will get into that a little bit. But giveaways versus takeaways, again, it's very subjective and different sites are going to have different information, especially if you're looking for advanced stats to tell you who the best is at whatever job it is in the National Hockey League, whether it's that giveaway takeaway ratio, the ability to get the puck out of their own zone, or the high danger chances. So when you're on the ice, does the team that you're playing on get more high danger chances for, or do you hurt your team and there's more high danger chances against when you're on the ice? So this is, pretty self-explanatory when it comes to the high danger chances. And there are definitely some defensemen out there that when they're on the ice, teams in their own zone a lot more. And you kind of find yourself a little bit frustrated by it as a fan of the team who's getting pinned down in their own zone. If you're a fan of the other team, you're like, this is great. We're having a great shift. And that's where the eyeball test can be different, because two different fan bases watching that game will have completely opposite reactions. I, as a fan watching that, might say, well, the team got pinned down because that defenseman didn't play very well on that, and that was just awful. Whereas the fan for the other team's like, stop making excuses. Your team's just trash, and our team's just better. And, you see that a lot online, right? Well, that's just an excuse. Your team just isn't very good. Leadership. And this, again, it's nebulous. What is good leadership? Like, we talk about how guys talk to the press. We talk about how they are on the ice. And are they personable? Are they loud? Well, it doesn't tell us how they are in the locker room, and it really doesn't tell us what their relationship's like towards other players. So leadership is this odd thing. There may very well be some players who are very loud, fans love them, and their teammates kind of roll their eyes when they talk and think, man, I wish he'd stop thinking about himself. So, because there is certainly with leadership, if you go too overboard, you're kind of in business for yourself at that point. But yeah, leadership is one of those things that gets brought up. It feels like it's talked about a lot with your star players when it comes to forwards and almost any defenseman if they're high profile on the team. Physicality. So physicality can be hitting, but you know what? It's also about being able to absorb a hit. And I think there are players who get hit constantly during the game. I don't very often see hits received versus hits given. I think that'd be an interesting stat on who gets hit the most. I mean, it may be out there. There's stat sheets on everything, so there's probably a list of who's taken the most hits, keeping in mind that some locations do measure hits differently than others, right? But I think the physicality argument, I think it's both. I think it's the ability to take and receive hits. And then with that physicality, too, it's about having that even temperament that when you take the hit, you're not necessarily going to respond with a slash, respond with a hook, right? And then there's the speed, the skating mechanics. There are defensemen in the NHL, and there's a lot fewer now than there was, say, 20 years ago. There are defensemen who aren't as fleet of foot as others. When they cracked down on all the hooking, holding, grabbing, and all that, that really weeded out the slow guys, the ones that couldn't keep up. Once they couldn't hook and grab and clutch, once the NHL decided to get rid of what was really holding the scoring down and keeping the skilled guys out of the game, it really changed defensemen. So you don't see as many defensemen in the National Hockey League who are slow as what we used to see. And it kind of makes them stand out a little bit more now if they are of the slower variety of defensemen, right? So speed is important, being able to move quickly, and it's important both in your zone exits as well as getting back. So when the puck gets turned over, you need to be able to get back. For a couple years there with Erik Karlsson, that was my argument against Erik Karlsson was if he turned the puck over, he did not have the foot speed to get back due to injuries. So when he turned it over, yeah, it's a breakaway. He's not catching up. Over the last season in San Jose, as well as the start of this year, I don't feel like the speed is holding him back like it was prior. So that's why I will say that when he says he's 100% healthy, I tend to agree with him. Because you can see that in the game, right? And the ability to draw penalties, it's one of those things that I know the NHL tracks. I've thought about tracking it myself. If it wasn't for like games like last night where there's 10 games on and good luck keeping track of all the penalties. But it is something that you can get a guy on your team as a defenseman who gets under the skin of that opposing forward to the point where they turn around, two-handed cross-check, they're off to the box, your team gets a power play, and it can be done by almost any defenseman. And really almost any player on the ice, of course, but we're just talking about defensemen here. You could have a third-pairing defenseman who has no offensive acumen, but he's smart defensively, he's got good positioning, and maybe he's got enough physicality where the opposing team's just tired of him. They're tired of him, and you get a forward who turns around and decides, I'm going to two-hand you. I'm going to slash you across the hands. I'm done with this. Leave me alone. So drawing penalties, I think, is an important part of being a good defenseman and again, a good player in general. Shot blocking. So shot blocking has evolved over the years. Shot blocking, I would say, if you look back as recently as the 90s, you very rarely saw shot blocking. There were some shot blockers, sure. But in general, it was seen that if you were a prime player, if you were a big money guy, don't be out there blocking shots. We don't want you breaking your ankle blocking a shot. And that's changed. Now there's kind of an expectation that most players will block shots. The John Tortorella doctrine has kind of got around, and coaches are like, yeah, you should block shots. So now when a guy from the point's taking a shot, he might have 3 players he has to get that puck through before it gets to the goaltender. There is the counter argument as well, that when everybody's standing in front of the goalie trying to block the shot, well, now if I'm the goaltender, I can't see what's going on, so I really hope they block that shot. There are times where the guy who's trying to block the shot, it goes in off his stick into the net, where it goes in off his leg into the net or off his skate. And that has to be frustrating for a coach. It has to be frustrating for the team. But again, the NHL, the way that it's being played right now, shot blocking is key. And so a guy winds up with a slapper, really good snapshot, even a good wrister. You got to get in the way and hope that it doesn't hit you in the head and, get you in the ear. I do feel like there's a lot of injuries that take place because of shot blocking, but it is part of the game, and it is part of what people look for in a good defenseman. So you might have a defenseman that has 30 points. Maybe he's only got 30 points, but he has good zone exits. He doesn't give the puck away. His shot blocking is good. He throws a lot of hits. Maybe he's an assistant or alternate captain or a captain. I keep thinking assistant, but it's alternate captain. And maybe the high danger chances for and against are really in favor of your team. So you can forgive the goals, the assists, the points not being there. The funny part is, if it's the opposite, if the goals, the assists, and the points are there, but there's more high danger chances against, maybe he's not physical, doesn't block shots, then you hear about how he's one-dimensional, right? Whereas, again, going back a generation, that'd just be how an offensive defenseman works. So there are things you have to take into account as well. So as many things as we have here, there's other parts you have to take into account. The team's style of play and the coaching. Some of this stuff, sometimes you'll have a defenseman that's playing a style of hockey they aren't really all that comfortable with, or they're not suited for. And so you may have a style of coaching that's hurting their play. You may also have a style of coaching that's making them look better than they are, where they adapt to a situation, they adapt to that coaching, and they look excellent. And so we as fans go, they're great, all the numbers look great, and then they get traded to another organization, and they're no good. And this absolutely happens. There are some organizations that are very good at maximizing the potential via coaching and a style of play that makes the players look absolutely excellent. And they might be excellent in that situation, and then you move them off to another team, and it doesn't work. The partner on defense. So this is for the Moritz Seider fans out there everywhere, right? Jake Wallman is an excellent partner. When it was Ben Sherratt that was the partner for Moritz Seider, it hurt his play. So it absolutely is a factor. So if you have a really good defenseman, say you've got one defenseman that's great, but the rest of that defense core cannot measure up, his numbers could get negatively impacted by who he's playing with and the team he's playing for via being overworked. So coming down here, you have defensemen that I think get overworked, that they look great in October, great in November, and by the time you reach March and April, they're just done. Too many minutes, maybe they're being utilized incorrectly, maybe they've been partnered with somebody all season that it just doesn't work, and they kind of go into a spiral when it comes to their play. And so that can be a factor where we look at a player as the season rolls on. Some players, their play gets stronger, some it weakens. And so while it might be easy to point a finger and go, well, he's clearly not an elite defenseman, he couldn't keep it up over 82 games, there can be other factors. And it can be who he's playing with, who he's playing for, and how they're deploying him. Age. So one thing that I've always remarked at is that, like right now we have Connor Bedard. I understand he's not a defenseman. I'm using him as an example. Right now, a lot of people are like, he can't take a face-off. He's young. When young guys come into the league, they're not good at face-offs. Comparatively speaking, with somebody who's been in the league for 15 years, they're not going to be very good at face-offs. They learn. They get better. They adapt. Lots of practice, and it gets better. And so season over season, it will get better. Whether it's Sidney Crosby, whether it's Patrice Bergeron, when they come into the league, they are not as good at face-offs as they will become. But with defensemen, they make mistakes that they will not make as veterans. And so I've noticed people will pile on to a young defenseman who's in maybe his early 20s, maybe his second or third year, and it's, the guy's garbage. The guy's clearly garbage. Look at him out there. And it's like, he's young. He's still learning the NHL. The NHL's a really difficult league. The first thing that players will tell you is, it's so much faster than any other league, and it's much more difficult. Players are a lot bigger. It's a more physical league. And especially if you consider if it's a young player that's coming over from Europe, playing maybe on the bigger ice surface, coming over to play on an NHL ice surface, now you have to get used to a game that's faster, that hits harder, that's on a smaller ice surface. The game's completely different. It is, if you get a chance to watch a game on European ice, if you haven't, and I would imagine there's streams and all this for some of the European leagues, watch it. It's a completely different game. This is why when people have said, with the size of the players and everything, maybe we could make the NHL ice the same size as the European ice, it would completely change the game. And I think scoring would drop. I think there'd be extra room, but I think there's also more room to defend. I think it'd be easier to keep guys away from your net. So it's one of those careful what you wish for. And of course, for an NHL owner, you're then going to them and saying, you're going to have a lot less seats in the building because we want to make the ice wider. I don't know that there's very many owners that are going to be happy about that. And then there's the sheltered minutes versus overworked. So this again comes back to some of the younger players. where they might have excellent stats because a coach is very careful about where they deploy them. Is it an offensive zone faceoff? Is it a defensive zone faceoff? How many minutes a night do you give them? And so they might have great stats, but they play fewer minutes. And then you have players, too, who are put into a position where maybe they're being expected to be this great defenseman for a team, and they're being played 24, 25 minutes a night, and realistically they should be playing 19 to 20 or 20 to 21. And over a period of 82 games, that takes its toll, and they're overworked. There's been times where I've watched NHL defensemen get overworked into the ground. I remember in Vancouver, Garth Butcher Garth Butcher, he never turned down a shift. He was out there and he did his job. But by the time Vancouver traded him, I felt like, I don't know if there's much left because he had been overplayed for so long. And so when you look at a team that's towards the bottom of the league, you're going to have guys who are probably in situations they wouldn't be in if they were playing on a contender. And then the thing is, you might have a defenseman that looks bad like San Jose. You might have a defenseman that looks bad in San Jose that if you put him in Boston, the exact same defenseman suddenly looks really good. Because you've got a better system. He's not going to get overworked. He's not going to be asked to do things that maybe he's not as comfortable with as he might if he's in a situation in San Jose where he has to play all of the minutes. So there's that side of it too. And then there's the subjective versus subjective. And this is why I don't get into all the arguments. This is why when I did my list videos, I was on vacation and I just left it. I thought these are who I believe are the best forwards, the best defensemen, the best goaltenders in the NHL based on all the games I watched this past season. And I'm going to post these videos, and I know people are not going to agree with me. And in some cases, are there times where maybe I'm subjective where I should be more objective? Probably, yeah. And I think most analysts, that happens. You're going to have that vibe part where you're like, well, this guy's top 10 in the league. He's a great player. And there may not be all of the stats to back it up. You may just say the eyeball test, which does get criticized quite a bit. But I don't know how to enjoy hockey without watching it. I've tried. I've tried to figure out how to look at just charts and enjoy that as hockey, and it just doesn't work. So the eyeball test, I think, is important. And clearly, people still find that important because when lists are made up, you'll see, we talked to some scouts, we talked to some general managers, we talked to some coaches, we talked to some players. And at that point, you're getting probably good information and good feedback, but there's always going to be that subjectivity. There's always going to be that player that you really like. And if it's a defenseman, he might be taking all kinds of hits. He might be shot blocking absolutely ridiculous shots that you think he's insane to try to block, right? And you may think he's a fantastic defenseman, whereas somebody else doesn't see it because maybe they don't watch that team as much. This is one of the reasons why for this channel I watch as much hockey as I can, and I try to watch every team equally. Last night, the Florida-Vancouver game, I didn't see nearly as much of it as I would have before the channel existed because I had to track all the other games going on as well. That's just one of the trade-offs. And then at the end of the season, I have to kind of look and say, this is where I think these players are on a list. But I'm well aware there's an objective and a subjective opinion, and whenever it comes to a list, you're going to have something subjective in there somewhere, unless it is just flat out, here's your points leaders, here's your hits leaders, here's your high danger chance, and just the numbers. But when you're getting into the high danger chances and everything, somebody wrote all that down, somebody decided all that, and so there's always just a little bit of subjectivity there, because there may be some reasons as well. Because one thing that can affect a player with almost all of this is injury. Players playing through injury. So you may have a defenseman who's excellent, who gets hurt, and just doesn't have a very good year statistically. And so you can look back at that and say, look, he was hurt all year. And then again, you're going to have fans saying, that's just an excuse. He's just one of your favorite players. And they might be right, but that doesn't mean that you're wrong. So at any rate, I don't really worry myself on where my favorite players are on anybody else's list. I try my best when I do list videos to be as fair as possible. But again, it is the internet, and there is that trick. So who do I think's the best defenseman in the NHL? I think it's Cale Makar. And I think that's been obvious in videos I've made for at least 3 years now, that Makar took over from Victor Hedman for me. Hedman, you know, he's older now, but Hedman's still an excellent defenseman for me. He's still top 5 in the league, and he's had a very good start with Tampa Bay after a bit of a down year last year by his standard. But when you set that standard that high, it means you're going to take more criticism when you don't quite reach that bar. But at any rate, I just wanted to do a video on this, so thank you for watching this if you got all the way through it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And I stopped where I did with how you can measure who the best defenseman is. I know there are other measurements, other stats, other ways to look at it, best hair, that kind of thing, you know. And of course, there are other things you can take into account as well. I just felt like this was enough information, and I didn't want to have to use a really big board and just look ridiculous. So there you go. So let me know your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.